The first gunshot still echoed in Sheriff Samuel Quaid's ears as he stood on the freshly dug grave. The Montana wind whistling through the pines like a hollow reminder of all he'd lost. It had been 3 months since outlaws had ridden into town and stolen everything that mattered his wife Elizabeth, caught in crossfire meant for him, leaving him alone with 3 children, and a badge that suddenly felt heavier than lead. Samuel removed his hat, revealing hair that had grayed considerably since that terrible day. At 34, the lines around his eyes had deepened, not from laughter but from grief that seemed to have permanently etched itself into his features. The townsfolk of Pine Creek said he'd aged 10 years in those 3 months. "Pa," came a small voice behind him. Samuel turned to see his eldest, Emma, just 10 years old but carrying responsibility in her eyes that no child should bear. Beside her stood 7-year-old James and little Rose, barely 5, clutching her worn rag doll. They were waiting for him, as patient as always, understanding in their own innocent way that their father needed these moments with their mother's grave. "Coming," he said, his voice rough with disuse. He hadn't said much these days, not even to his children. What was there to say when the woman who'd brought music and laughter into their home was gone? The 4 of them walked back toward town, a somber procession along the dirt road that led from the cemetery to Pine Creek. The settlement had sprouted up 15 years earlier during Montana's gold rush days, and though the boom had faded, the town remained a collection of wooden buildings, a general store, 2 saloons, and the small sheriff's office where Samuel had worked for the past decade. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly widow who'd been looking after the children during Samuel's working hours, met them at the edge of town. "Sheriff," she nodded, her face pinched with concern. "I'm afraid I can't watch the children tomorrow. My sister's taken ill in Helena and I must leave on the morning stage." Samuel felt his stomach knot. "How long will you be gone?" "At least a fortnight, I expect. Perhaps longer," he nodded, trying to hide his panic. Elizabeth had been the one who cared for the children, without her and now without Mrs. Peterson. He had no idea how to manage his duties as sheriff and as a father. "I heard there's a new schoolteacher arriving on tomorrow's stage," Mrs. Peterson offered, as if reading his thoughts. "Perhaps she might be willing to help, at least until I return." A schoolteacher. This was the first Samuel had heard of it. Mayor Thompson hired her from back east. Seems Pine Creek's finally getting a proper school. That night, after a quiet supper of beans and cornbread that Emma had prepared with solemn determination, Samuel sat on the porch of their modest house at the edge of town. The children were asleep inside, but sleep eluded him as it had most nights since Elizabeth's passing. The moon cast long shadows across the yard, and in the distance, the mountains stood like sentinels against the star-filled sky. It was beautiful country, this corner of Montana territory in 1878. Elizabeth had loved it here. They'd built a good life, despite the hardships, despite the dangers that came with his job. Now he was supposed to continue alone, raise 3 children alone, find a way to keep going when half his heart lay buried on that windswept hill. Morning came too soon. Samuel rose before dawn, stoked the fire, and put coffee on to boil. He had awakened the children and helped them dress, a task at which he was still terribly clumsy, especially with little Rose's buttons and Emma's hair ribbons. "Will we stay at your office today, Pa?" James asked, spooning porridge into his mouth. Samuel sighed. "I reckon so. Just for today until I figure something out." The stage wasn't due until noon, which meant a morning with 3 restless children in his small sheriff's office. He gathered paper and pencils for them, hoping they might draw quietly while he attended to his duties. Pine Creek was growing, and with growth came disputes between miners, drunken cowboys passing through, the occasional thief or con man. Samuel had a deputy, young Billy Hatcher, but the boy was barely 20 and more enthusiasm than experience. They walked together down Main Street, the children trailing behind Samuel like ducklings. The town was just waking up, shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks, the blacksmith already at his forge, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the bakery. "Morning, Sheriff," called Mr. Daniels from the general store. His smile faltered when he saw the children. Everyone in town knew their situation, and there was a collective pity that Samuel both appreciated and resented. The morning dragged slowly. Emma sat quietly drawing. James fidgeted and asked 100 questions about the wanted posters on the wall, and little Rose curled up in Samuel's chair and fell asleep. Samuel tried to concentrate on paperwork, but his mind kept returning to his predicament. Just before noon, the distant sound of the stagecoach horn broke through his thoughts. "It's here," James exclaimed, running to the window. "Pa, can we go see?" Samuel nodded, lifting the sleeping Rose. The four of them stepped onto the boardwalk, just as the stage rolled into town, dust billowing behind it as the driver pulled the horses to a stop in front of the hotel. The door opened, and several passengers disembarked, a traveling salesman by the look of him, a middle-aged couple, and then Samuel felt himself standing straighter, a young woman. She stepped down with grace, despite the journey's evident toll. She wore a simple blue traveling dress, and a sensible bonnet covered hair the color of burnished copper. Even from a distance, Samuel could see she was striking not in the conventional way of delicate beauty, but in her presence, the straightness of her spine, the alertness in her gaze as she surveyed her new surroundings. Mayor Thompson hurried forward to greet her. "Miss O'Brien, welcome to Pine Creek." "Thank you, Mayor," she replied, her voice carrying clearly across the street. "It's good to finally arrive." Samuel found himself rooted to the spot, watching as the mayor introduced her to several townsfolk. She smiled warmly at each one, and there was something about that smile genuine, open, that made Samuel's chest tighten unexpectedly. "Is that the new teacher, Pa?" Emma asked. "I believe it is." "She's pretty," James observed. Samuel didn't respond. Pretty wasn't the word. There was a liveliness to her that seemed to brighten the dusty street, a quality that felt almost foreign in his grief-shadowed world. Mayor Thompson spotted him and waved him over. Samuel hesitated, then crossed the street, children in tow. "Sheriff Quaid, allow me to introduce our new schoolteacher, Miss Nora O'Brien." "Miss O'Brien, this is our sheriff, Samuel Quaid." She turned toward him, and Samuel found himself looking into the clearest green eyes he'd ever seen. They reminded him of the alpine lakes high in the mountains, deep and unfathomable. "Sheriff," she said, extending her hand. "A pleasure to meet you." Her handshake was firm, not the dainty touch he'd expected. "Miss O'Brien, welcome to Pine Creek. And who might these children be?" she asked, her gaze softening as she looked at Emma, James, and Rose. Before Samuel could answer, James stepped forward. "I'm James Quaid, and this is my sister Emma, and that's Rose. She's the baby." "I'm not a baby," Rose protested sleepily from Samuel's arms. Nora O'Brien laughed, a sound so unexpected and melodious that several nearby people turned to look. "Of course you're not," she said to Rose. "You're a young lady." She turned back to Samuel. "Your children are beautiful, Sheriff." "Thank you," he said, feeling oddly discomfited. It had been a while since he'd spoken to a woman other than Mrs. Peterson or the wives of townsfolk who'd known him for years. This woman was a stranger, and yet there was something disarmingly direct about her manner. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. "Miss O'Brien, I'll show you to your accommodations. Mrs. Miller has prepared a room for you at the boarding house." "Thank you, Mayor. I look forward to settling in." She turned back to the children. "And I look forward to seeing you in school very soon. We'll be starting classes next week, as soon as I get everything in order." As she walked away with the mayor, Samuel caught himself watching her retreating figure. There was something about the way she moved, confident and purposeful, that seemed out of place in this rough-hewn frontier town. "I like her," James declared. "Me too," said Emma quietly. Samuel said nothing, but as they walked back to his office, he found himself wondering about Nora O'Brien, the new schoolteacher from back east with the laughing green eyes. It wasn't until that evening, as he was preparing supper for the children, that Samuel remembered his predicament. Mrs. Peterson was leaving in the morning, and he still had no one to watch the children. "Emma," he said carefully, "would you and James and Rose be all right staying with Billy tomorrow, just during the day?" Emma looked up from where she was helping Rose with a simple puzzle. "Deputy Hatcher, he's nice, but—" She trailed off. Samuel understood her hesitation. Billy was young and unmarried, with no experience handling children. "It would just be for a day or two, until I can find a more permanent solution." Before Emma could respond, there was a knock at the door. Samuel opened it to find Mayor Thompson standing on his porch. "Evening, Samuel," the mayor said, stepping inside when Samuel gestured. "I've come about your situation with the children." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "News traveled fast in Pine Creek. Mrs. Peterson mentioned you might be in need of assistance," the mayor continued. "I've spoken with Miss O'Brien, and she's willing to look after your children until school begins next week. She says it would give her a chance to get to know some of her future students." Samuel felt a surge of relief, quickly followed by uncertainty. "That's generous of her, but I wouldn't want to impose. She's only just arrived." "Nonsense. She insisted, said it would be her pleasure." Mayor Thompson lowered his voice. "She's a remarkable young woman, Samuel, 26 years old and already has 5 years of teaching experience in Boston. Comes highly recommended." Samuel pondered this. Having the children with Miss O'Brien would certainly be better than leaving them with Billy, and it would only be for a few days. "All right," he said finally. "Please thank her for me. I'll bring the children to the boarding house in the morning." After the mayor left, Samuel explained the arrangement to the children. James was immediately excited at the prospect of spending time with the new teacher. Emma seemed cautiously optimistic. Only Rose appeared uncertain, clutching her doll tightly. "What if she doesn't like us, Pa?" the little girl asked. Samuel knelt down beside her. "She'll like you just fine, Rosie, and it's only for a little while until school starts." That night, as he tucked the children into bed, Samuel found himself thinking again of Nora O'Brien. There had been something in her eyes when she'd looked at his children, a warmth, an understanding that had touched him unexpectedly. It had been a long time since he'd felt any emotion other than grief or duty, and he wasn't quite sure what to make of it. The next morning, Samuel dressed the children in their best clothes, brushed their hair until it shone, and gave them each a stern reminder about behavior. "Remember your manners," he told them as they walked toward the boarding house. "Miss O'Brien is doing us a favor." Mrs. Miller's boarding house was one of the nicer buildings in Pine Creek, a 2-story structure with a wide porch and flower boxes in the windows. Samuel led the children up the steps and knocked on the door. Mrs. Miller answered, a plump, pleasant woman with a perpetual flower dusting on her apron. "Morning, Sheriff. Miss O'Brien's expecting you. She's in the parlor." They followed her through the tidy entryway into a comfortable sitting room where Nora O'Brien stood by the window. She'd exchanged her traveling clothes for a simple dress of soft green that matched her eyes. Her copper hair was pulled back into a neat bun, though a few tendrils had escaped to frame her face. "Sheriff Quaid," She greeted them with that same warm smile. "Good morning, children." "Thank you for doing this, Miss O'Brien," Samuel said, suddenly aware of his work-worn appearance next to her freshness. "It's very kind of you." "Not at all. I'm happy to help." She knelt down to Rose's level. "I have something special planned for today. Would you like to hear about it?" Rose nodded shyly, her doll clutched to her chest. "We're going to have a picnic by the creek," Nora said, including all three children in her gaze. "Mrs. Miller has prepared a wonderful lunch and I've brought some books to read." "Books?" James perked up. "What kind of books?" "Adventure stories, mostly. Tales of brave knights and explorers. Would you like that?" James nodded eagerly. Even Emma looked interested. Samuel felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. "I should be back by supper time," he told Nora. "If there's any problem, we'll be fine, Sheriff," she assured him. "Enjoy your day." As Samuel walked to his office, he realized he was breathing easier than he had in months. The children were in good hands, and for the first time, he could focus on his duties without constant worry. The day passed quickly. Samuel made his rounds, settled a dispute between two minors, and even had time to catch up on the pile of paperwork that had been accumulating on his desk. By late afternoon, he found himself glancing frequently at the clock, oddly eager for the day to end so he could retrieve his children. When he finally closed the office and headed toward the boarding house, he was surprised to hear a sound that had become rare in his household: laughter. Children's laughter, floating on the evening air. He followed the sound to the back garden of the boarding house, where a remarkable scene greeted him. Emma, James, and Rose were seated on a blanket spread beneath an apple tree. Nora O'Brien sat with them, a book open on her lap, but she wasn't reading. Instead, she was telling a story, her hands moving expressively, her face animated. And then the elephant said, "Why, I never forget a face, but in your case I'll make an exception," she finished. The children erupted in giggles. Even Emma, who had become so serious since her mother's death, was laughing unreservedly. Rose was practically rolling with mirth, her little face alight with joy. Samuel stood rooted to the spot, watching. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard his children laugh like that, so freely, so uninhibitedly. The sound pierced through the fog of grief that had surrounded him for months, touching something he thought had died with Elizabeth. Nora looked up and saw him. "Sheriff." "We were just finishing our story time. Children, your father is here." "Pa," James called. "Miss O'Brien knows the funniest stories. She made faces and everything." "Did she now?" Samuel approached the blanket, feeling oddly like an intruder in this circle of happiness. "We had a wonderful day," Nora said, rising gracefully. "Your children are a delight, Sheriff." "Pa, can we stay a little longer?" James pleaded. "Miss O'Brien was going to teach us a game." Samuel hesitated, seeing the hope in his children's eyes. "We shouldn't impose any further on Miss O'Brien's kindness." "It's no imposition," Nora said. "In fact, Mrs. Miller has invited all of you to stay for supper. She's made enough stew to feed an army, she says." The invitation was tempting. It had been a long time since they'd eaten a meal they hadn't prepared themselves, and the thought of Mrs. Miller's cooking was appealing. But more than that, Samuel was reluctant to end this moment, to take his children away from this unexpected happiness. "Well, if Mrs. Miller insists," he said finally. The children cheered, and Nora's smile widened, reaching her eyes in a way that made Samuel's chest tighten again with that unfamiliar feeling. Supper was a livelier affair than any meal the Quaid family had shared in months. Mrs. Miller's dining room was warm and inviting, her stew rich and flavorful. Two other boarders joined them, a young clerk from the bank and an older gentleman who worked for the stage line. Throughout the meal, Samuel found his gaze returning to Nora O'Brien. She had a way of drawing people out, asking questions that showed genuine interest, listening attentively to the answers. Even shy Emma was talking more than usual, telling Nora about her drawings. "Would you show me sometime?" Nora asked. "I've always admired those with artistic talent." Emma nodded, a pleased flush coloring her cheeks. "I could bring some tomorrow if you'd like." Samuel realized with a start that Emma was assuming they would return to Miss O'Brien's care the next day. He cleared his throat. "Miss O'Brien, I was wondering if you'd be willing to continue looking after the children until school begins. I would compensate you, of course." "I'd be happy to, Sheriff, and no compensation is necessary. As I said, it gives me a chance to get to know my future pupils." She turned to the children. "What shall we do tomorrow? Perhaps a nature walk. I'd love to learn about the local plants and animals." "There's a beaver dam up the creek," James offered eagerly. "Pa took us there once, we could show you." "That sounds perfect," Nora said. After supper, as the sun set and the room grew dimmer, Mrs. Miller lit lamps and brought out a checkerboard. James challenged Nora to a game, and to Samuel's surprise, she accepted with enthusiasm. "My father taught me to play when I was about your age," she told James as they set up the pieces. "He said it teaches strategy and patience." "My ma taught me," James said, and then looked uncertainly at his father, as if afraid he'd said something wrong. But Nora handled the moment with grace. "She must have been a wonderful teacher," she said gently. "It's a special gift, to pass on knowledge to those we love." James nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears that quickly gave way to concentration as they began to play. Samuel watched, something stirring in his soul. It had been months since anyone had mentioned Elizabeth so naturally, so matter-of-factly. In town, people avoided the subject, as if speaking her name might shatter him. But Nora had acknowledged James's memory without awkwardness or pity, and Samuel was grateful for it. The evening ended too soon. Rose had fallen asleep on the sofa, and even James was yawning despite his protests that he wasn't tired. "We should get home," Samuel said, lifting Rose into his arms. "Thank you for everything, Miss O'Brien, Mrs. Miller." "It was our pleasure," Nora said, walking them to the door. "I'll expect the children at 9 tomorrow if that suits," Samuel nodded. 9 is fine. Good night, Miss O'Brien." "Good night, Sheriff." "Good night, Emma." "James, sleep well." As they walked home through the quiet streets of Pine Creek, Samuel felt a curious lightness. The weight of grief was still there, it would always be there, but somehow it seemed less crushing tonight. "I like Miss O'Brien," Emma said quietly as they reached their house. "She listens when you talk, really listens. And she doesn't treat us like babies," James added. Samuel nodded, understanding what they meant. Nora O'Brien treated them with respect, as individuals with thoughts and feelings of their own, not just as objects of pity. That night, after the children were asleep, Samuel sat on the porch again, looking at the stars. For the first time in months, his thoughts weren't entirely consumed by what he had lost. Instead, he found himself thinking about copper hair and green eyes, about the sound of his children's laughter, about the possibility that life might still hold moments of joy. The next few days fell into a pattern. Samuel would take the children to the boarding house in the morning, then pick them up after his duties were done. Each day, Nora had planned something different: the promised nature walk, a visit to the new school building where she let them help arrange books and desks, an afternoon of stories and drawing. Each evening, the children had new tales to tell, new experiences to share. They seemed to be coming back to life before Samuel's eyes, shedding the somber quiet that had descended on them since their mother's death. On the fourth day, Samuel arrived at the boarding house to find Nora and the children in the kitchen with Mrs. Miller, their hands dusted with flour, laughing as they shaped cookie dough. "Pa," Rose cried when she saw him. "We're making cookies. Miss Nora showed us how to make shapes. Look, I made a star." Samuel felt a smile tugging at his lips, a sensation so unfamiliar it almost hurt. "That's a fine-looking star, Rosie." "Would you like to join us, Sheriff?" Nora asked, a smudge of flour on her cheek that made her look younger, almost girlish. "We have plenty of dough left." He should refuse. He had reports to write, duties to attend to. But the scene before him was so inviting, so warm, that he found himself nodding. "I suppose I could stay for a while." He removed his hat and gun belt, hanging them on a peg by the door, and rolled up his sleeves. Under Nora's guidance, he attempted to shape a cookie that was meant to be a horse but looked more like a misshapen dog. The children found this hilarious, and to his surprise, Samuel found himself laughing with them. The sound of his own laughter startled him. It had been so long. Elizabeth had always been the one to make him laugh, to draw him out of his seriousness. Since her death, he hadn't thought he'd ever laugh again. He caught Nora watching him, a soft expression in her eyes that he couldn't quite interpret. She quickly looked away, turning her attention back to the cookies, but the moment lingered between them like an unspoken question. Later, as they sat around the table enjoying the fruits of their labor, Mrs. Miller mentioned the upcoming Founders' Day celebration. "It's this Saturday," she told Nora. "The whole town turns out. There's a picnic, games for the children, dancing in the evening." "That sounds lovely," Nora said. "I imagine it's a wonderful way for the community to come together." "You should come, Miss Nora," James exclaimed. "You could see our pa shoot in the contest. He always wins." Samuel felt his face warm. "Not always, James. Almost always," Emma corrected solemnly. "Ma used to say Pa could shoot the eye out of a needle at 50 paces. Again, that moment of tension at the mention of Elizabeth, and again, Nora navigated it with gentle grace. "I'd love to see that," she said. "And I'd be honored to attend the celebration with all of you if you'd have me." "Of course," Samuel found himself saying, though he hadn't planned to go this year. The thought of the celebration without Elizabeth had been too painful to contemplate. But now, looking at his children's excited faces, he knew he couldn't disappoint them. "We'd be pleased to have your company." As they walked home that evening, the children chattering about Founders' Day, Samuel realized something had shifted. The memory of Elizabeth was still there, would always be there, but it was becoming possible to speak of her without that knife twist of pain. To remember the joy she'd brought into their lives, not just the agony of her loss. And somehow, Nora O'Brien was part of that change. Her presence in their lives, brief as it had been, had created a space where healing could begin. The next day, Friday, was the children's last day with Nora before school officially began on Monday. Samuel found himself strangely reluctant to say goodbye to this temporary arrangement. The children had thrived under Nora's care, and he had grown accustomed to their evening conversations, to the warmth in her eyes when she greeted them, to the way she always had a story or observation that made him see his own town with fresh eyes. When he arrived to collect the children that evening, they were sitting on the porch swing with Nora between them, singing a song he didn't recognize. Their voices blended sweetly in the twilight, and Samuel stopped at the gate, not wanting to interrupt the moment. Nora looked up and saw him, but she didn't stop singing. Instead, she smiled and motioned for him to join them. Without thinking, he did, settling on the porch step near the swing. The song was a gentle one about a bird finding its way home. When they finished, Rose immediately demanded another, but Nora shook her head. "It's time to go home with your father now, little one, but tomorrow is Founders' Day and I'm sure there will be plenty of music." "Will you sing with us tomorrow, Miss Nora?" Rose asked. If you'd like me to, yes. Samuel cleared his throat. We usually meet by the big oak at the edge of the celebration grounds, around noon if that suits you. That would be perfect, Sheriff. As they prepared to leave, Nora knelt down to give each child a hug. Thank you for a wonderful week, she told them. I've enjoyed every moment. We'll see you tomorrow, Emma reminded her, and then at school on Monday. Yes, but it won't be quite the same as our special week together, will it? Nora's eyes met Samuel's over the children's heads. This was something special. Samuel nodded, unable to find words for the gratitude he felt. Until tomorrow, Miss O'Brien. Until tomorrow, Sheriff. Founders' Day dawned clear and warm, a perfect late summer day. The celebration grounds on the edge of town were already bustling when Samuel arrived with the children shortly before noon. Bunting in red, white, and blue adorned every available surface, and tables groaned under the weight of covered dishes for the community picnic. Emma wore her best dress, a blue cotton that Elizabeth had made her just before she died. James and Rose were similarly dressed in their Sunday best, and Samuel had put on a clean shirt and his least worn pair of trousers. He'd even trimmed his beard that morning, a task he'd been neglecting of late. They made their way to the oak tree, greeting neighbors and friends as they went. Samuel was conscious of the sympathetic glances, the two hearty greetings that betrayed people's discomfort with his grief. It had been this way since Elizabeth's death. People didn't know what to say, how to act around the widowed sheriff and his motherless children, but today felt different somehow. The children's excitement was infectious, and Samuel found himself looking forward to the celebration in a way he hadn't expected. There she is, James suddenly called, pointing. Samuel turned to see Nora approaching, and for a moment he forgot to breathe. She was wearing a dress of soft yellow, her copper hair loose around her shoulders save for a few strands pinned back with a yellow ribbon. In the sunlight, she seemed to glow. Miss Nora. Rose ran to her, arms outstretched. Nora knelt to embrace her, then stood to greet Emma and James with equal warmth. Sheriff, she said finally, turning to Samuel, what a beautiful day for a celebration. Indeed it is, Miss O'Brien. He tipped his hat, suddenly aware of how many people were watching their interaction. Nora O'Brien had caused quite a stir in Pine Creek during her short time there. A young, unmarried schoolteacher from back east was a novelty in their frontier town, and her beauty and charm had not gone unnoticed. "Shall we join the festivities?" he asked, offering his arm without thinking. She hesitated just briefly before placing her hand on his sleeve. "Lead the way, Sheriff." The day unfolded in a haze of pleasure that Samuel had not expected to feel again. They ate at the communal tables, sampling dishes from every household in Pine Creek. They watched the children's races, cheering as James took second place in the boys' sprint. They applauded the local band's somewhat off-key but enthusiastic renditions of patriotic songs. And through it all, Samuel was aware of Nora beside him, her laugh, her observations, the way she made each person she spoke to feel valued and heard. The children adored her, that much was clear. They vied for her attention, brought her treasures they'd found, beamed when she praised them. As the afternoon progressed, it was time for the shooting contest. Samuel almost declined to participate, but the pleading in his children's eyes changed his mind. "You must uphold your reputation, Sheriff," Nora teased gently. "I've heard so much about your marksmanship." "It's just a bit of fun," he said, but he found himself stepping up to the line when his name was called. The contest was simple: hit a series of increasingly difficult targets. Samuel had won 5 years running, but he hadn't practiced much since Elizabeth's death. Still, when he raised his revolver, the familiar weight in his hand centered him. He took a breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger, 5 shots, 5 targets hit dead center. The crowd erupted in applause, none louder than his own children. "Did you see, Miss Nora?" James was jumping up and down. "Pa hit everyone." "I saw," Nora said, her eyes meeting Samuel's with something like admiration. "Your father is a man of many talents." Samuel felt a flush creep up his neck that had nothing to do with the afternoon heat. As evening approached, lanterns were lit and tables cleared to make room for dancing. The local fiddler struck up a lively tune, and couples began to take their places. Samuel had no intention of dancing. He and Elizabeth had always opened the dancing at Founder's Day, but that tradition had died with her. He was content to sit on a bench with Rose dozing in his lap, watching Emma teach James a new clapping game Nora had shown them. Sheriff Quaid. He looked up to find Nora standing before him, illuminated by lantern light that turned her hair to living flame. "The children tell me you're an excellent dancer," she said. Samuel shook his head. "I haven't danced since," he stopped, unable to finish. Nora's expression softened. "I understand. But perhaps, just one dance. The children would love to see you." He looked over at Emma and James, who were watching hopefully. Then he looked back at Nora, at the gentle invitation in her eyes, and something inside him shifted. "One dance," he agreed, carefully transferring the sleeping Rose to the bench, covering her with his jacket. Nora's hand was warm in his as he led her to where other couples were moving to the music. It had been so long since he'd touched a woman like this, with intention, with awareness. He placed his other hand at her waist, maintaining a respectful distance between them as they began to move. "I should warn you, I may be a bit rusty," he said. "You're doing fine, Sheriff," she assured him, following his lead with natural grace. As they turned and stepped in time to the music, Samuel found himself relaxing into the dance. Nora was light on her feet, responsive to his slightest guidance. They moved together as if they'd danced 100 times before. "Thank you," he said quietly after a few moments. "For what?" "For my children, for bringing laughter back into their lives." Her eyes softened. "Your children are wonderful, Sheriff. They've brought just as much joy into my life this past week." They danced in silence for a moment, the music swelling around them. "May I ask you something, Miss O'Brien?" Samuel said finally, "Of course. Why did you come to Pine Creek? A woman with your education, your talents you could have taught anywhere. Why choose a frontier town in Montana territory?" She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice was thoughtful. "I wanted something real. In Boston, everything was so prescribed. What a young lady should do, how she should behave, who she should marry. I was suffocating." Her eyes met his, clear and direct. "Out here, people are who they are. There's no pretense, no hiding behind social niceties. Life is harder, yes, but it's more honest." Samuel nodded, understanding completely. "And has Pine Creek lived up to your expectations?" A smile curved her lips. "It's exceeded them, Sheriff. I've found more here than I ever expected to find." The music ended and they stepped apart, though Samuel found himself reluctant to release her hand. As they returned to where the children waited, he was acutely aware of the eyes following them, the whispers behind hands. "People are talking," he murmured. "Let them talk," Nora replied. "We've done nothing wrong." That was true, but Samuel knew how quickly rumors could spread in a small town. Nora was new, vulnerable to gossip in a way that he, as an established figure in Pine Creek, was not. "Still, I should be more careful of your reputation," he said as they reached the bench where Rose still slept. Nora's expression was unreadable in the flickering lantern light. "My reputation is my own concern, Sheriff, but I appreciate your consideration." The rest of the evening passed pleasantly. Rose woke and demanded her turn to dance with Miss Nora. which Nora graciously granted, twirling the little girl until she was breathless with giggles. James had a turn next, standing as tall as his 7-year-old frame would allow as he escorted Nora around the dance floor. Even Emma, usually so reserved, asked Nora to teach her a dance she'd mentioned from back east. The two of them moved together at the edge of the dancing area, Nora patiently guiding Emma through the steps, both of them laughing when they got tangled up. Watching them, Samuel felt a pang of something like longing. This was how it should be, his children happy, laughing, experiencing the simple joys of childhood. Elizabeth would have wanted this for them. She wouldn't have wanted them trapped in grief, just as she wouldn't have wanted that for him. As the celebration wound down and families began to head home, Samuel gathered his sleepy children. Rose insisted on a good-night hug from Nora, and then James and Emma did the same. "Thank you for joining us today," Samuel said as they prepared to leave. "The children had a wonderful time." "As did I," Nora replied. "It was a perfect day." She hesitated, then added, "I'd be happy to walk part of the way with you. My boarding house is in the same direction." Samuel nodded, pleased by the suggestion despite his earlier concerns about gossip. It was a warm night, the stars bright overhead as they walked through the quieting town. Rose was asleep in Samuel's arms, her head resting on his shoulder. Emma and James walked ahead, their voices drifting back as they discussed their favorite parts of the day. "They're remarkable children," Nora said softly. "You've raised them well." "Elizabeth deserves the credit," Samuel replied. "She was." He trailed off, searching for words. "She must have been an extraordinary woman," Nora said when he didn't continue. "To have created such a beautiful family, to be so loved still." There was no jealousy in her voice, no resentment of the ghost that walked with them, only understanding and something like respect. "She was," Samuel agreed, "the best person I've ever known." They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the boarding house. The children said their goodbyes, extracting a promise from Nora to save them seats at the front of the classroom on Monday. "Good night, Miss O'Brien," Samuel said, tipping his hat. "Good night, Sheriff." She smiled, that warm smile that seemed to reach inside him and touch places long cold. "Thank you for a lovely day." He watched her climb the steps and enter the boarding house before turning toward home, his sleeping daughter in his arms, his other children walking beside him, chattering happily about the day's events. For the first time since Elizabeth's death, Samuel went to bed with a sense of peace, a feeling that perhaps life could still hold goodness, could still offer moments of joy amid the sorrow. School began on Monday, and with it came a new routine for the Quaid family. Samuel would walk the children to the schoolhouse in the morning, then pick them up when classes ended in the afternoon. Each day, they had new stories to tell about Miss Nora and her lessons, about the books she read to them, the songs she taught them, the gentle way she corrected their mistakes. Samuel saw less of Nora now that she was occupied with her teaching duties, but he found himself looking forward to their brief interactions at the beginning and end of each school day. She always had a special smile for him, a word about how well Emma was doing with her reading, or how quickly James grasped mathematics, or how sweet Rose was during story time. 2 weeks after school began, a late summer storm swept through Pine Creek. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and rain fell in sheets that turned the streets to mud. Samuel worried about the children walking home in such weather, so he left the office early, taking an umbrella large enough to shelter all 4 of them. He arrived at the schoolhouse just as classes were ending. Children spilled out onto the covered porch, peering anxiously at the downpour before dashing to waiting parents or running homeward under improvised shelters. Inside, he found Nora at her desk, helping Emma with a particularly difficult word in her reading book. James was cleaning the blackboard, and Rose was carefully arranging a collection of pine cones by size. "Pa," James called when he spotted him. "You should see what Miss Nora taught us today about numbers." "I'd like to hear all about it," Samuel said, "but first we need to get home before this storm gets any worse." "Sheriff Quaid," Nora greeted him, rising from her chair. "You're early today." "Thought the children might need some extra shelter getting home," he explained, holding up the umbrella. "That was thoughtful of you." Her gaze shifted to the window where rain lashed against the glass. "It's quite a storm." "One of our Montana specials," he agreed. "They blow in fast and hard, but they usually pass just as quickly." The children gathered their things, and Samuel helped Rose with her coat. As they prepared to leave, Nora hesitated at her desk. "Are you headed home now, Miss O'Brien?" Samuel asked. "I should stay a bit longer, finish grading some papers," she said, though she cast another glance at the worsening storm. "We could walk you to the boarding house," he offered. "It's on our way, and that umbrella is big enough for one more." She considered for a moment, then nodded. "That's very kind. Thank you." They left the schoolhouse together, huddled under the large umbrella. The rain was coming down harder now, and the wind had picked up, making it difficult to keep the umbrella steady. Samuel found himself drawing Nora closer, his arm nearly around her shoulders as he tried to keep all 5 of them dry. They were halfway to the boarding house when a particularly strong gust turned the umbrella inside out with a crack. Rain immediately soaked them, and Rose let out a startled cry. "Run for it," Samuel called, taking Rose's hand and grabbing James's collar as the boy was about to dash into the muddy street. They ran the rest of the way to the boarding house, arriving on the porch drenched and breathless, but laughing at their misadventure. "You're all soaked through," Nora said, looking at the children with concern. "You can't walk home in this, you'll catch your death." As if to emphasize her point, lightning flashed, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that made Rose bury her face in Samuel's leg. "Come inside," Nora urged, "at least until the worst passes." Samuel hesitated, but another look at his dripping children made the decision for him. They followed Nora into the boarding house, where Mrs. Miller took one look at them and immediately began fussing. "Heavens above, you're all wet as drowned rats. Come by the fire, children. Sheriff, there are towels in the cupboard. Miss O'Brien, perhaps you could find some dry clothes for the little ones." Within minutes, the children were wrapped in blankets by the fire, their wet clothes hanging on a rack in the kitchen. Mrs. Miller brought hot cocoa and cookies, clucking over them like a mother hen. "The storm's getting worse," she observed, peering out the window. "Sheriff, you and the children should stay for supper. No sense in going back out in that." Samuel knew he should refuse, should insist on getting the children home, but the warmth of the house and the comfort it offered were too tempting. "If it's not too much trouble," he said. "No trouble at all," Mrs. Miller assured him. "I've got a stew that's been simmering all day, plenty for everyone." While Mrs. Miller returned to her kitchen, Nora sat with the children, teaching them a game involving hand movements and a rhyming song. Their laughter filled the parlor, bright and infectious. Samuel watched from his place by the window, struck again by how natural Nora seemed with his children, how easily she had slipped into their lives. There was nothing forced or artificial about her interactions with them. She genuinely enjoyed their company, treasured their unique personalities. "Pa, come learn the game," James called. "Miss Nora says it's more fun with more people." Samuel joined them, sitting cross-legged on the floor as Nora explained the rules. It was a simple game, but amusing, and soon all 5 of them were laughing as they tried to keep up with the increasingly complex patterns. Supper was served in the dining room, where they were joined by the other boarders. The conversation was lively, the food delicious, and Samuel found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did in social situations these days. Nora sat across from him, her hair still damp from the rain, her cheeks flushed from laughter and warmth. She looked, he thought, like she belonged there at that table with his children with him. The thought startled him, and he quickly turned his attention back to his stew. After the meal, they returned to the parlor, where Mrs. Miller had set up a checkerboard for James and the bank clerk, while Rose climbed into Nora's lap for a story. Emma sat nearby, working on a sampler Nora had been teaching her to stitch. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the boarding house, all was warm and peaceful. Samuel found himself reluctant to leave, to return to the quiet of his own house, to the empty space where Elizabeth's presence should be. "I believe the rain is letting up a bit," Mrs. Miller observed around 8 o'clock, "though it's still coming down." Samuel knew they should go, but Rose had fallen asleep in Nora's arms, and James was yawning despite his protests that he wasn't tired. "You're welcome to stay the night," Mrs. Miller offered unexpectedly. "I've plenty of room." The children could sleep in the blue room, and you could take the small guest room at the end of the hall. Samuel was about to refuse when Nora spoke. "It would be much safer than walking home in the dark and rain," she said softly, her eyes on Rose's sleeping face. "And the children are already settled." He looked at his daughter, peaceful in Nora's arms, at James nodding off over the checkerboard, at Emma's drowsy concentration on her stitches. "All right," he agreed. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller." The arrangements were quickly made. The children were settled in a large room with 2 beds, Rose and Emma sharing one, James in the other. Samuel helped tuck them in, promising to be just down the hall if they needed anything. "I like it here," Rose mumbled sleepily as he kissed her forehead. "It's warm." "Yes, it is," he agreed, understanding she meant more than just the temperature. After the children were asleep, Samuel found himself back in the parlor with Nora. Mrs. Miller and the other boarders had retired for the night, leaving them alone by the dying fire. "Thank you for your hospitality," Samuel said, aware of the intimacy of the moment, the two of them in the firelit room, the sounds of rain against the windows, the house quiet around them. "I should be thanking you," Nora replied. "This evening has been special." Samuel nodded, understanding what she meant. There had been something magical about the unexpected storm, the impromptu supper, the games and laughter by the fire. It had felt like a glimpse into another life, a life where grief didn't cast its long shadow. "May I ask you something, Sheriff?" Nora's voice was soft in the dim light. "Of course. Are you happy here?" "In Pine Creek," the question caught him off guard. "It's my home," he said after a moment. "It's where my children were born, where their mother is buried." "That's not what I asked." He met her gaze across the short distance between them. "I was happy," he said honestly. "Before, now I'm—" He searched for the word. "Surviving," Nora nodded as if his answer confirmed something she had suspected. "And the children, are they happy?" Samuel thought about it. "They're children," he said finally. "They adapt, they find moments of joy, but they miss their mother. They miss what our family was." "And what was it?" she asked gently. "Complete," he said, the word coming to him unbidden. "We were complete." Nora was quiet for a long moment, her gaze on the glowing embers in the fireplace. "I believe," she said finally, "that there are different kinds of completeness. That what seems broken beyond repair can sometimes become something new, something whole in a different way." Samuel felt a tightness in his chest at her words. They touched on something he'd been afraid to acknowledge, even to himself, that life might go on, that happiness might be possible again in a new form. "I should let you rest," Nora said, rising from her chair. "Good night, Sheriff." "Samuel," he said impulsively, "My name is Samuel," she smiled, a soft, intimate smile that made his heart beat faster. "Good night, Samuel." "Good night, Nora." The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world washed clean, the air fresh with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Samuel woke early, disoriented briefly by the unfamiliar surroundings before remembering where he was. He dressed quickly and went to check on the children, finding them still asleep, peaceful in the soft morning light. Downstairs, he found Nora in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Miller prepare breakfast. She looked up when he entered, a smile lighting her face. "Good morning, Samuel." "Coffee, please," he said, still unused to hearing his given name on her lips but finding he liked it very much. They ate breakfast together, the children joining them as they woke, sleep rumpled and hungry. It was a pleasant meal, filled with talk of the previous day's adventures and plans for school that morning. "We can't be late, Miss Nora," James said as they prepared to leave. "You're the teacher," Nora laughed, ruffling his hair. "We'll make it just in time, I promise." They walked together to the schoolhouse, the children running ahead, excited by puddles to splash in and the fresh, clean feeling of the world after a storm. "I wanted to thank you," Samuel said as they walked, "for yesterday, for taking care of the children so often these past weeks." "It's been my pleasure," Nora assured him. "Your children are a joy to be around, Samuel," he nodded, gathering his courage for what he wanted to say next. "I was wondering if you might join us for supper this evening at our home. The children would love it and—" He hesitated. "So would I." Nora's eyes widened slightly and for a moment Samuel feared he'd overstepped. But then she smiled, that warm, genuine smile that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. "I'd be honored," she said. "What time should I arrive?" 6 o'clock. 6 it is. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself," Samuel said, then added hastily, "though the children would never forgive me if I didn't mention they're hoping you might tell one of your stories afterward." Nora laughed. "I'll come prepared with my best tales." They had reached the schoolhouse, where other children were already arriving. "Until this evening, then," Nora said, her gaze lingering on his face for a moment before she turned to greet her students. "Until this evening," Samuel echoed, watching her go with a lightness in his step that had been absent for too long. The day passed in a blur of anticipation. Samuel completed his duties with unusual efficiency, then hurried home early to prepare for their guest. The house, which had been merely functional since Elizabeth's death, suddenly seemed shabby and neglected through Samuel's critical eyes. He set the children to tidying up while he tackled the kitchen. Emma helped him plan the meal, a roast they'd been saving for a special occasion, potatoes, carrots from their small garden, and an apple pie from the bakery for dessert. By the time the table was set, and the roast was in the oven, filling the house with savory smells, Samuel realized he was nervous. This was the first time he'd invited a woman to their home since Elizabeth's death. It felt significant, a step towards something he wasn't sure he was ready for. But when Nora arrived, punctual at 6 o'clock, wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a small bundle of wildflowers for the table, all Samuel's doubts faded. She belonged here in this house, with his children with him. The realization was as startling as it was clear. "Welcome," he said, taking her shawl. "Something smells wonderful." "Pa's been cooking all afternoon," James informed her. "He hardly ever cooks anymore." Samuel felt a flush of embarrassment, but Nora just smiled. "Then I'm especially honored," she said. "I love a home-cooked meal." The evening was everything Samuel had hoped it would be. The food turned out well, the conversation flowed easily, and the children were on their best behavior, eager to show Nora their home, their toys, their daily lives. After supper, they gathered in the small sitting room. True to her word, Nora told stories, funny tales that had the children in stitches, adventure stories that widened their eyes, and finally, a gentle story about a family of birds that made a new nest after a storm destroyed their old one. Samuel watched his children's faces as they listened, saw the trust there, the enjoyment, the love they already felt for this woman who had come into their lives so unexpectedly. And he watched Nora, the expressiveness of her face, the warmth in her eyes, the gentle way she included each child in her storytelling. And somewhere during that evening, as the lamps cast a golden glow over his family, and the woman who had brought laughter back into his home, Samuel Quaid realized he was falling in love. The thought should have terrified him, should have filled him with guilt. But instead, it felt right, as if Elizabeth herself were whispering to him that it was time, that it was okay to open his heart again. When the children were finally asleep, exhausted from excitement, Samuel walked Nora to the door. "Thank you for coming," he said. "It meant a lot to the children." "And to you?" she asked softly. Samuel met her gaze. "And to me," he admitted. They stood there for a moment, the space between them charged with unspoken feelings. Samuel wanted to reach out to touch her hand, her face, but he held back, uncertain. "I should go," Nora said finally. "It's getting late. May I walk you home?" She nodded. "I'd like that." The night was cool and clear, the stars brilliant overhead as they walked through the quiet streets of Pine Creek. They didn't speak much, but the silence was comfortable, filled with shared understanding. At the boarding house, they paused on the porch, reluctant to end the evening. "Nora," Samuel began, then stopped, unsure how to put his feelings into words. "Yes, Samuel." Her voice was gentle, encouraging. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that tonight meant a great deal to me. Having you in our home, seeing you with the children, it felt right." Nora's eyes softened. "It felt right to me too. I haven't." He took a deep breath. "Since Elizabeth died, I haven't allowed myself to think about the future, about happiness. It seemed like a betrayal of her memory." "And now?" Nora asked quietly. "Now I'm beginning to think that the greatest betrayal would be to let grief consume what's left of our family. Elizabeth would have wanted us to be happy, to live fully." Nora nodded, understanding in her eyes. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Samuel agreed. "And I think she would have liked you." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Then slowly Samuel reached out and took Nora's hand in his. Her fingers were warm, slender, strong as they curled around his. "Good night, Nora," he said softly. "Good night, Samuel," she replied, her eyes bright in the moonlight. He released her hand reluctantly and watched as she entered the boarding house, turning at the door to give him one last smile before disappearing inside. As Samuel walked home through the sleeping town, he felt lighter than he had in months, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The grief was still there, it would always be there, but it was no longer the only emotion in his heart. There was hope now, and the beginnings of something he had thought forever lost. The days that followed took on a new rhythm. Samuel found excuses to visit the schoolhouse during the day, bringing forgotten lunch pails or books the children had left at home. In the evenings, Nora often joined them for supper, or they would visit her at the boarding house, where Mrs. Miller always had cookies for the children and a warm welcome for Samuel. The town noticed, of course. Pine Creek was too small for such changes to go unremarked. There were whispers, raised eyebrows, knowing glances. Some thought it was too soon for the widowed sheriff to be courting again. Others believed it was exactly what the Quaid family needed. Samuel heard the gossip but paid it little mind. He was more concerned with his children's feelings, with whether they were ready for the changes happening in their family. He found his answer one evening as he tucked them into bed after Nora had spent the day with them, teaching Emma to bake bread, helping James build a model of a fort, reading stories to Rose. Pa, Emma said as he smoothed her quilt. I like it when Miss Nora visits. I'm glad, he replied. She seems to enjoy being here. She makes you smile again, James observed from his bed across the room. Like you used to. Samuel felt a lump form in his throat. Does she? James nodded solemnly. Ma would like that, I think. She always said your smile was her favorite thing. Out of the mouths of babes, Samuel thought, blinking back sudden tears. Your mother was a very smart woman, he said. Miss Nora is smart too, Emma said, and pretty, and she tells the best stories. She does indeed, Samuel agreed. Pa, Rose's small voice came from where she lay beside Emma. Can Miss Nora stay with us forever? The question, so innocent and direct, caught Samuel off guard. Would you like that, Rosie? He asked carefully. Rose nodded, her eyes serious. She makes us laugh, and she makes you laugh too. I like it when you laugh, Pa. Samuel looked at his youngest daughter, then at James and Emma, seeing in their faces the same hopeful expression. I like it too, he admitted, and I like making Miss Nora laugh as well. So she can stay, Rose persisted. It's not that simple, little one, Samuel explained. Miss Nora has her own life, her own choices to make. But you could ask her, James suggested, as if it were the most obvious solution in the world. Samuel chuckled. Perhaps I could at that, but not just yet. These things take time. But the children's words stayed with him that night, echoing in his mind as he sat on the porch, looking at the stars. They were right, Nora brought laughter back into their home, into his life. She made them whole in a new way, different from what they had been with Elizabeth, but complete nonetheless. The next day was Sunday, and as had become their custom, Samuel and the children escorted Nora to church, then invited her to join them for Sunday dinner afterward. It was a beautiful autumn day, the trees beginning to turn gold and red, the air crisp but pleasant. After dinner, Samuel suggested a walk, and they strolled through town and out toward the creek, the children running ahead, collecting colorful leaves and interesting stones. They're happy today, Nora observed, walking beside Samuel at a leisurely pace. They're happy most days now, he replied. Thanks in large part to you, she shook her head. I can't take credit for that. Children are resilient by nature. They just needed time and gentle encouragement to find joy again. And what about their father? Samuel asked, his voice low. What did he need? Nora looked up at him, her green eyes serious. The same, I think. Time, encouragement, permission to be happy again. Samuel stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The children were some distance ahead, absorbed in their exploration of the creek bank. Nora, he said, gathering his courage, I need to tell you something. Her expression was open, expectant. Yes. These past few months, having you in our lives, it's changed everything. You've brought light back where there was only shadow. You've made my children laugh again, made me laugh again, and He took a deep breath. I've come to care for you deeply. Nora's eyes widened, but she didn't look away. Samuel, please let me finish, he said gently. I know it might seem too soon. I know there are those in town who think I'm disrespecting Elizabeth's memory. But the truth is, I believe she would want this for us, for me, for the children. She would want us to be happy. I believe that too, Nora said softly. Then you should also know, Samuel continued, that I'm falling in love with you. Perhaps I've already fallen, and I'm not asking for anything in return, not yet. I just needed you to know. Nora was quiet for a moment, her gaze dropping to her hands, then lifting to his face again. What if I told you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, that I feel the same? Samuel felt his heart leap. Do you? She nodded, a smile breaking across her face like sunrise. I do. I've tried to be cautious, to respect your grief, the children's needs. But yes, Samuel, I've fallen in love with you and with Emma, James, and Rose. Samuel reached for her hands, taking them in his. They were warm, slightly rough from her work at teacher's hands, a woman who wasn't afraid of hard work or frontier life. "Nora O'Brien," he said, "you are the most remarkable woman I've ever met save one, and I think she would approve of you entirely." Nora's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "That's the highest compliment you could give me." Samuel was about to reply when a shout from James interrupted them. "Pa, Miss Nora, come see what we found." They turned to see the three children waving excitedly from the creek bank. Still holding Nora's hand, Samuel led her toward them, feeling as though his heart might burst with happiness. The children had discovered a turtle, a common enough sight but a source of great excitement nonetheless. As Nora knelt beside them, explaining about the creature's shell and habits, Samuel watched her with his children, her patience, her enthusiasm matching theirs, her genuine interest in their discovery. And in that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that this was right, that this woman belonged with them, that the future held promise after all. That evening, after Nora had returned to the boarding house and the children were asleep, Samuel sat at the small desk in his bedroom and opened the drawer where he kept Elizabeth's things, her letters, her wedding ring, a lock of her hair. He took out the ring, holding it in his palm, feeling its weight. "Lizzie," he said softly to the empty room, "I hope you understand. I hope you know I'll never forget you, that you'll always be a part of us. But I think I've found someone who can help us be whole again in a new way. The children love her, and so do I." He waited, almost expecting some sign, some message from beyond. But there was only the quiet of the house, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves outside his window. Yet he felt at peace, as if his words had been heard and accepted. Samuel carefully replaced the ring in the drawer, closing it gently. Then he went to the window and looked out at the night sky, at the stars that had witnessed his grief and now witnessed his hope. Tomorrow, he would speak to Mayor Thompson about the position of schoolteacher, about the town's expectations and Nora's future in Pine Creek. And then, perhaps, he would visit the jeweler in Helena on his next trip to the territorial capital. But that was for tomorrow. Tonight, Samuel Quaid, widower, sheriff, father, went to bed with a lightness in his heart that had been absent for too long, and dreamed of green eyes and copper hair, of children's laughter, of a future bright with promise. The weeks that followed were filled with a joy that Samuel had thought forever lost to him. Each day brought new discoveries, new moments of happiness as he, Nora, and the children forged their path forward together. There were practical matters to consider, of course. Samuel spoke with Mayor Thompson about Nora's position as schoolteacher, about the propriety of their relationship. The mayor, a practical man who valued education and stability in his growing town, gave his blessing, with the understanding that they would observe all proper decorum. "The town needs that school, Sheriff," he said. "And those children of yours need a mother. Miss O'Brien seems to fill both roles admirably." The children's excitement grew as they realized that Nora was becoming a permanent part of their lives. They began to include her in their future plans, their dreams, their everyday conversations. "When Miss Nora lives with us," James would say, or "Miss Nora can help with that," Emma would suggest. Samuel watched it all with a heart full of gratitude. It wasn't that they were forgetting Elizabeth, far from it. They still visited her grave each Sunday after church, still spoke of her often, still kept her memory alive in 100 small ways. But they were healing, moving forward, finding happiness again. Nora, for her part, approached the delicate situation with grace and sensitivity. She never tried to replace Elizabeth in the children's hearts, never presumed upon her growing role in their lives. Instead, she created her own place, her own unique relationship with each of them. With Emma, she shared a love of books and learning, encouraging the girl's natural intelligence and curiosity. With James, she matched his energy and enthusiasm, never tiring of his questions or his boisterous play. And with little Rose, she offered the nurturing tenderness that the child so desperately needed. As autumn deepened toward winter, Samuel made his planned trip to Helena, returning with a small velvet box that he kept hidden in his desk drawer. He wanted the moment to be perfect, wanted the children to be part of it. The opportunity came on a crisp November evening when the first snow of the season began to fall. Nora had come for supper, and afterward they all gathered on the porch to watch the silent white flakes drifting down from the darkening sky. "It's like magic," Rose breathed, her face upturned to catch snowflakes on her cheeks. "It is indeed," Nora agreed, her arm around the little girl's shoulders. Samuel looked at them, Nora, Rose, Emma, and James silhouetted against the falling snow, their faces alight with wonder. This was his family, he realized. Not just the children, but Nora too. She belonged with them, had become essential to their happiness, to his happiness. "Children," he said quietly, "I have something I'd like to ask Miss Nora, and I'd like you to be here when I do." 3 pairs of eyes turned to him, then to Nora, who looked puzzled but expectant. Samuel reached into his pocket and withdrew the velvet box. As understanding dawned on the children's faces, excitement on James's, joy on Emma's, confusion quickly turning to delight on Rose's, he stepped forward and took Nora's hand in his. "Nora O'Brien," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart, "you came into our lives when we needed you most, though we didn't know it at the time. You brought laughter back into our home, hope back into our hearts. You made my children giggle until I found myself laughing too, something I thought I'd never do again." Tears welled in Nora's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "The children and I have talked about this," Samuel continued, "and we're in agreement. We would be honored if you would consider becoming a permanent part of our family." He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring with a small emerald that matched her eyes. "Nora, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, and a mother to these children who already love you as their own?" For a moment Nora couldn't speak, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Then she nodded, her voice breaking as she said, "Yes, yes, with all my heart." The children erupted in cheers. James jumped up and down. Emma clapped her hands and Rose threw her arms around Nora's waist, hugging her tightly. Samuel slipped the ring onto Nora's finger, then leaned forward to kiss her, a gentle, tender kiss that held the promise of all their tomorrows. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "And I love you," she replied, her arms going around his neck as the children danced around them in the falling snow. They were married on Christmas Eve in the small church of Pine Creek, with Mayor Thompson officiating and the entire town in attendance. The church was decorated with evergreen boughs and red berries, candles glowing in every window. Emma, James, and Rose stood with them at the altar. Emma holding the ring on a small cushion, James proudly straight-backed in his best suit, Rose scattering flower petals from a basket nearly as big as she was. Nora wore a gown of deep blue velvet, her copper hair crowned with a wreath of holly. Samuel, in his best black suit, watched her walk down the aisle toward him with a sense of wonder and gratitude that this remarkable woman had chosen to share his life, to mother his children, to build a future with him. As they exchanged their vows, Samuel felt a sense of rightness, of completion. He would always love Elizabeth, would always honor her memory. But Nora was his present, his future, the woman who had brought him back to life when he thought that part of him had died forever. The town celebrated with them afterward. A grand feast in the hotel dining room, music and dancing until late in the night. The children, allowed to stay up far past their bedtime for this special occasion, eventually succumbed to exhaustion. Rose fell asleep in Nora's lap, James under a table where he'd been collecting dropped coins, Emma in a chair beside Mrs. Peterson, her head nodding despite her efforts to stay awake. Samuel gathered his sleeping son, while Nora carried Rose and Mrs. Peterson helped the drowsy Emma. They made their way through the snowy streets to Samuel's house, their house now, where Mrs. Peterson would stay with the children for the night, while the newlyweds spent their wedding night at the hotel, in a special suite prepared for the occasion. After tucking the children into their beds, with kisses and whispered promises to see them in the morning, Samuel and Nora stepped back into the winter night, hand in hand. "Are you happy, Mrs. Quaid?" Samuel asked as they walked toward the hotel. Nora looked up at him, her face glowing in the moonlight that reflected off the snow. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she assured him. "And you, Sheriff Quaid, are you happy?" Samuel drew her close, kissing her softly as snowflakes dusted their shoulders. "I am," he said. "Thanks to you and the children and the second chance we've been given, I am truly happy again." They continued on their way, their footprints making a single trail in the freshly fallen snow, walking together into the future. They would build a future filled with love, with family, with laughter that had once been lost, but was now found again. 5 years later, on a warm summer evening in 1883, Sheriff Samuel Quaid sat on the porch of his expanded house at the edge of Pine Creek, watching his family in the yard before him. Emma, now 15, sat under a tree with a book, occasionally looking up to smile at her siblings' antics. James, 12, was teaching his 3-year-old brother Thomas how to pitch a ball, the little boy's face screwed up in concentration as he threw with all his might. Rose, 10 now and growing more like her mother Elizabeth every day, was helping Nora tend the garden, her small hands carefully weeding around the tomato plants while Nora, her belly rounded with their third child together, supervised from a nearby bench. And toddling between them all, falling and getting up again with the resilience of the very young, was Sarah, their first daughter together, her copper hair catching the evening sun just like her mother's. Samuel watched them, his heart full to bursting. The years had brought changes to Pine Creek, a proper bank, a new church, more businesses as the railroad had finally reached them. Samuel himself had been elected mayor last year, when old Mayor Thompson retired. Nora still taught at the school, though she took breaks when their children were born. She was loved by the town, respected for her intelligence, her kindness, her unwavering support of her husband and family. The grief of those dark days after Elizabeth's death had never completely disappeared, but it had transformed into something gentler, a sweet sadness that Samuel could now bear without being crushed by it. The children still visited their mother's grave, still spoke of her, still kept her memory alive in their hearts, but they had room there for Nora too, for the woman who had stepped into their broken family and helped make it whole again in a new way. Emma, James, and Rose called her Ma now, a decision they had made themselves about a year after the wedding. Thomas and Sarah knew only Nora as their mother, but they knew about Mother Elizabeth too, from stories and the portrait that hung in the parlor. As Samuel watched, Nora looked up and caught his eye, smiling that same warm smile that had first captivated him all those years ago. She said something to Rose, then made her way across the yard to join him on the porch, lowering herself carefully onto the swing beside him. "Penny for your thoughts, Mr. Mayor," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. Samuel put his arm around her, his hand resting gently on the swell of their unborn child. "Just thinking about how fortunate I am," he said. "How fortunate we all are." Nora followed his gaze to the children playing in the golden evening light. "We are blessed," she agreed, "though I think young Thomas may be getting more dirt on that ball than throwing it." Samuel chuckled, the sound coming easily now, a daily occurrence rather than the rare miracle it had once been. "James has patience. He'll make a ball player out of him yet." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, enjoying the peace of the evening, the sounds of their children's play, the simple joy of being together. "Samuel," Nora said suddenly, "do you ever wonder what might have happened if I hadn't come to Pine Creek, if our paths had never crossed?" Samuel considered the question. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I think I might have continued as I was existing but not living, going through the motions for the children's sake but never finding joy again." Nora squeezed his hand. "I'm glad I came then." "So am I," Samuel said, turning to look into her eyes, still as green and clear as the day they'd met. "So very glad." From the yard came a peal of laughter as James's throw went wild and Rose had to chase the ball into the flower bed. Thomas toppled over in his mirth, and even serious Emma was giggling behind her book. Samuel joined in their laughter, the sound rising from deep within him, unforced and genuine. He had thought, in those dark days after Elizabeth's death, that he would never laugh again. But Nora had made his children giggle until he did too, and in doing so, had taught him that life could still be beautiful, still be worth living fully. As the sun set over Pine Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Samuel Quaid held his wife close, watching their children play, and gave thanks for second chances, for healing, for love that could grow even from the ashes of grief. And most of all, for laughter, the sound of joy returned, of life continuing, of a family made whole again.